Smart people deal with their traumas differently to a more average person, and that's not said to be judgmental, but my experience working with very intelligent, very creative, very spiritually open people who've also experienced terrible traumatic things, and I'm really talking about the worst things. You can see the title in this video. It's not clickbait. I'm talking people who've been physically, emotionally, or otherwise slapped around by life, by certain individuals, by certain families, by certain partners, and certain life situations that I can't even say the actual word on YouTube, otherwise my channel is going to be censored. The worst abuses, these are the kinds of things that I'm talking about. Dark, heavy trauma. It's bad enough by itself. It gets even worse if you're a smart person who has the cognitive capacity to be able to adjust and present and redigest and replay the scenes, the experiences, and the certain traumatic baggage on repeat. If you have that intelligence, if you have the imaginative capacity and you're interested in compartmentalizing and ultimately trying to find out ways to uncompartmentalize and then renegotiate and integrate aspects, and you're doing this interior psychic game of Jenga with your own emotional well-being, you're in a very, very, very tricky place. And I know what that feels like because I've been there myself. Today we're going to be exploring a shadow work style approach to particularly heavy trauma, and once again, if I need to say a trigger warning explicitly, this is going to be not a digestible video, but it's hopefully going to have real therapeutic value. I'm responding to this question from a 17-year-old who says that he's trying to learn how to differentiate between my normal everyday conscious thoughts and deep buried unconscious traumas, and also how to integrate them. He says, I have a decent recollection of my childhood traumas now, but I still fail to see how to integrate these parts of me. Sometimes I even feel like I'm fooling myself into believing what I see are unconscious thoughts. And that's why I framed out this video with the focus on intelligence, because if you're in that particular band of consciousness where you see different perspectives and you see different stories and you're playing things out from different angles, you're really in a very difficult situation, and I'm trying to make a very specific video. The key thing that stands out to me from this question is, how do we differentiate between unconscious thoughts or potential unconscious traumas and the conscious action, symptoms, or problematic behaviors which are coming up in our everyday life? The number one way to work through dark traumas and actually be able to reconcile the various fragmentations is to work with time. This is what I've learned from years of client work, hundreds of books on trauma psychology. You need to take a time-based perspective. And that means looking at the past, which is when the trauma happened, looking at the present, which is when the symptomatic behaviors of anxiety, depression, shutdown, rage, whatever that might be, when that's happening right now, and also the future-based perspective, because if you've experienced someone slapping you around in your childhood, physically, emotionally, or in more destructive and horrific ways than that, you're going to be experiencing pain in the present because there's all that terror, all that anxiety, and if you look towards the future, you might be worried that you'll attract a kind of partner who will do that to you again, that you'll be in a situation like that again, or whatever it might be. The past informs the future. Your hopeless future weighs down on your anxious present, and the present situation doesn't give you enough genuine resilience to create a new future because the old trauma is still weighing you down. You need to work on that timeline. And if you can work on that plane of what happened before, and then separating out to what's happening now, and then separating out what's happening now to not being a repeat that's destined for the future, you're going to get as quickly as I can possibly suggest to the foundation of your own unconscious baggage, your own shadow repressions across the board, because you're seeing it in as linear fashion as possible, which makes it easy to understand. It's not the complete story, but we need to start somewhere, and at the very beginning of working with dark traumas, I need to invite you to make a dividing line, a boundary in your consciousness. That happened in the past. That trauma happened in the past. Even if it was just this week, it's not happening right now, because that gives you just enough breathing space to be able to then see that the secondary consequences of a re-traumatizing experience where you're being triggered by something aren't actually the exact extension of the past traumatic event, but a reinterpretation of either the previous traumatic event or a similar situation that reminds you of that past traumatic event. It's not exactly the same. Yes, symptomatically, someone who's in unhealed trauma energy might struggle to differentiate between something which is unconscious and in the background and something which is here in the present and something which is extending into the future. But if we can make that spaciousness, if I can get you into the present, and this is where things like meditation and mindfulness and certain meditative breathwork practices and somatic grounding experiences, where I could guide you through an exercise and say, notice 5 things around you that you can see, 4 things that you can touch, 3 things that you can think of that happened in your day, 2 things that you have tasted today, and 1 thing that you can smell in the room, brings you back into the present moment. There's so many different techniques and tactics. I want to focus on the principle. You're interested in presence, because if you can get into the present moment and you have a present moment which isn't weighed down by the traumatic patterns from before and isn't anxiously imagining or fantasizing about a repeat of that in the future, you've got the spaciousness to change both. You can't literally change the past, and you're not going to literally create the future unless you want to go down a manifestation, magic, spiritual bypassing escape route. But you can start to change your stories, and that's where shadow work and trauma work really start to come together. Throughout this series, this is the 3rd episode of an 8-part shadow work series. We've been exploring shadow territories, shadow entities, and shadow behaviors. In the previous episode, we looked at how to do active imagination, and now we're making that as practical as we possibly can by doing that timeline separation. You need to be in the present moment. And once you're in that present moment, you can go either way. Let's go to the past to begin. If you're looking back at the thing that happened in the past, fundamentally, it's accepting that it was an unsafe situation, it was painful, it was damaging, and honestly, it was bloody scary, and you never want that to happen again. Usually I work with people who've had horrific and disgusting situations in their childhood, or unfortunately in the most trusted relationships that they've been in, either with the man or the woman that they're dating. You need to know that that won't happen again, to actually feel like you can separate out the traumatic baggage from the past to a new hopeful future, which means fundamentally we need to shift the conversation from just working with time at a narrative level to the actual character traits of resilience. Resilience is what I always focus on with trauma survivors, because no matter if it's a romantic trauma, if it's a childhood trauma, it's a career trauma, whatever the trauma might be, fundamentally, you've got a feeling and an experience and a self-identity construct of being unsafe and being on edge. Yes, you can be relaxed. Get into the present moment. We just discussed this. Get into that calm moment where you've got a little bit of spaciousness, even for just 5 minutes. Meditate. Take a nice bubble bath. Go for a nice walk in the forest. Fantastic. But what happens when you get triggered? Something rustles in the bushes and you think that it's someone coming to rob you or take your life in one way or another. You're in the bubble bath and you put your head under the water and then you get some water up your nose and you feel like you're being drowned because of a certain experience in your childhood. When the trigger happens, you can't rely on the presence or the calm feeling. You need to have the resilience to be able to bring yourself back to center and respond with strength. That's the element that's missing from a lot of trauma work, because trauma work, which is focused fundamentally on compassion and a more feminine style, safety making with love and understanding and acceptance, doesn't have that masculine strength aspect of, okay, you're in danger, what are you actually going to do about it? Yes, you're not actually in danger when you're going through the walk and a squirrel in the tree triggers off the branch, but your anxious feeling in that moment is, something's there, and maybe it's a little bit dark, maybe it's sunset time, and you think that someone's been stalking you because you had a horrific experience like that in the past. It all happens way too quickly. It doesn't happen so quickly if you have a deep character construct inside of you that you're strong, you're resilient, and you know how to get out of bad situations. It's the unavoidable, unfortunately, unavoidable reality baseline that you can't skip away from in some kind of narrative, either going past or going to the future. You actually need to feel like you can run, like you can punch, like you can push, like you know where you are. You need to feel like you can bring yourself back to center. Of course, if you're in the bathtub, water goes up in your nose and you get triggered, you're like, ooh, and you just calm yourself down. That's resilient. You're resilient. Wow, that brought up a memory of something that happened with my dad or with my brother when I was a child. You've got the space there. You've got the present moment and you've got the past. You separated them out because of your resilience being the safety anchor which you can rely upon in the moment. Today's questioner was reporting that they're kind of new to trauma work and they couldn't quite tell if their anxiety was something that's related to unconscious baggage or more of an everyday thing. If you're resilient and you're empowered in your own emotional self-regulation, which also means being the kind of person that you can depend upon, then you won't get swept up in so much of either the regressive, traumatic re-experiencing or the fantasy, traumatic imaginings of what future might be, what your future might be. It's so difficult to try and put into words because it depends, of course, on the individual situation that you're thinking of. Someone who I'm working with who may have been through a particularly difficult romantic trauma where something horrific's happened within a romantic relationship might be in a very different situation to something that happened when they were 5 years old with their mother or with their uncle. Again, someone else who's been in a career trauma where their reputation's been destroyed and they're in this very shameful, where they've been publicly shamed or something like that's happened, they're going to be in a very different place compared to someone who's dealing with something from 30 years ago. The immediacy of the moment does matter, because if something happened last week and you didn't resiliently handle that, you do have the ability to strengthen yourself and you do have the ability to be able to bring about some things. For example, you can physically condition yourself, you can be physically healthier. There is such a thing as being actually put together. If you notice that you're screwing yourself up with drink and drugs and vice, you can become more resilient and more empowered and more stable and be able to depend on yourself by doing things which are actually self-loving and improve your self-esteem. You might be thinking, Jordan, why does self-esteem and self-love have anything to do with shadow work and trauma work? Of course it does. Self-esteem is one of the day-to-day anchors of how we choose to make decisions. If you're in a high self-esteem state, you can be triggered by something and then not take it personally. You can separate out things. For example, myself. If I hear a car go past all of a sudden, and for some reason I get a trigger to an old childhood trauma of a car going past, and it was a really scary moment, and I get dropped into that, I'm making something up, I get dropped into in this moment, because I'm high self-esteem, filming this for you, having this conversation, I don't make it mean anything. But if I was really low self-esteem, I'm more vulnerable to smaller, shameful, shut down feelings inside of me, which then create a narrative within half a second of that someone who's come to hurt me. Because I'm already in that hurt state. The present moment resilience is a real thing. And if we face it towards the future, that's where it gets even more interesting. From a high self-esteem baseline, from a high self-love baseline, built on reality change, knowing that the trauma happened in the past and you're working on it, you've got enough presence in the everyday, you can start to create a better future. One of the most important things that I've found in working with, for example, women who've experienced romantic trauma or men who've experienced family trauma, and this is, I'm not going to go into any story in particular, but the clients I work with, for many reasons, they come to me and when I ask them a few weeks in, why did you choose to work with me rather than someone else? They typically say something like, well, you've got that strong masculine energy and you're also quite feminine and soft when you need to be, and I feel like I can rely upon you. I feel like I can trust you. I feel like this is safe. It's not complex, but you need someone who's either gone through those experiences. They can see that I've gone through some experiences. You need some of that, but fundamentally you need someone who's strong and reliable and dependable to be able to share things that would make you feel vulnerable and dissipate and dissolve. You shouldn't give your deepest, darkest pain to someone who can't hold it, because you'll then be left in a doubly dissolved situation where you just can't do anything with it. But what happens if you haven't got a therapist or a coach or a facilitator and you're not giving your energy over to them and it's just you doing your own shadow work? You need to imagine that the future version of you is also that stronger, more resilient and more practically minded part of you, which is just, I'll never be in that situation again. You set your life up in a way where you don't need to have contact with the family members. You don't need to have contact with the ex-partner. You don't need to be in that certain kind of toxic career space. You don't need to be hooked on substances and vice. You have a future which inspires you and which feels safe, fundamentally safe, actually safe. I have a vision of my future where I'm going to be on a wonderful off-grid small holding, maybe half-grid, I'm not going to be fully off-grid, but that kind of small holding out in the forest, lots of land, family, friends, beautiful, creative opportunities. That's what makes my heart relax. I'm not in a particularly anxious state overall. I love where I live right now. I've still got nature all around me, but the full future of where this is going to go 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, having that vision informs my present, because even if a traumatic flashback comes through of how bad it was in the past, I can rely on my resilience and my self-empowerment in this moment, and if that's not working, I can remind myself, okay, I can't really connect to this moment right now. I can't connect to my beautiful library right here, but I'm going to skillfully fantasize about the future that I can get to, and that can be a useful survival mechanism if you're really struggling in that immediate moment with an anxiety or a depression. Someone who's fundamentally depressed, when I've worked with clients who've gone through a depressive swing, they need hope, they need energy, they need force, they need drive. If I'm speaking to someone who's in that depressive shutdown, I try and give as much as I can to warm them up. I'm almost like a bonfire that's warming their cold hands, and I try and get them to the point where they feel like they can do something with their energy, and then they can go and make change that day. I usually do that by pointing towards the future, because the future can change and the future can be organized. It can be fundamentally shifted based on the self-esteem and the vision and the imagination of the individual you're working with. Maybe it's getting a bit repetitive on the same point. How do we wrap all this together? How do we use shadow work and bring it into the trauma work perspective? Once again, I do have an entire course on this. It's taken me years to put together. I have entire modules on trauma work, inner child work, somatic healing, romantic shadows in particular, and then the higher stages of the personal and collective unconscious. That's all over there. You can see the link in the description if you want to join me for true depth in a single video. The way to make shadow work for you, the way to integrate your unconscious, is to see your unconscious splitting into the past unconscious, the future unconscious, and the present unconscious. You work along the timeline, because then it gives you a bit of space that everything isn't happening all at once, especially people who suffer from anxiety or depression. When that cloud wraps up your perception, you feel like the past, the future, and the present all collapse into something which is unmanageable and overwhelming. If you can get at least 3 segments in your psyche, it's clear. It's clear. Of course, the past is informing the present is shaped by the past, the present goes into the future. You can get more complex, but if that exact moment of working with your unconscious anxieties and depressions and trying to figure out, like today's questioner, how do I know if this is really from the past or if this is something that's just happening right now, you'll be in a much better position on the walk through the forest when the squirrel scares you a little bit, because you are unprepared to just go, oh, actually, I haven't eaten today and I'm actually kind of dehydrated, and no wonder that scared me. I'm a bit on edge, and I'm gonna relax my arms. You don't make it mean something about the traumatic situation of the past, and you don't then imagine 2 minutes ahead that something else is gonna happen. You're not dropped into it. It's your work. I tried to give an overall framing. I've tried to give as much as I can while also being as generalized as I can, and also, unfortunately, not using the exact language that I would use in private sessions or inside my course, because I have to censor myself on YouTube, because if I say too many of certain kinds of dark and disgusting words on the internet, my video doesn't go anywhere. It either gets demonetized or my channel gets flagged. So I've tried my best to indicate towards the worst things that people experience. I haven't been able to face it directly, so if it's felt a little bit incomplete and it feels like I haven't actually talked about the thing that you're trying to heal from, that particular dark trauma, I apologize. I do have limitations while making a publicly available video on YouTube and being aware of algorithmic language censoring. I hope I've given you enough to work with practically. Your shadow work is your unique journey. This video is episode 3 of an 8-part series. You can see the shadow work playlist in the description. I've actually already uploaded 3 hours of material directly from my private course, and we discuss things like inner critic and also looking at the somatics of releasing repressed anger. You can see that immediately by clicking down there, or you can click over here on the screen and watch the whole shadow work playlist, which includes the next episode in this series. And we'll keep going, and we'll keep going, and hopefully find our center.